James Monroe's presidency would be known as the era of good feelings. The War of 1812 was over, the Federalist Party was decimated, therefore party politics was at its minimum, and there was relative economic prosperity. Monroe was also the last president to have fought in the Revolutionary War. Andrew Jackson was a courier in the militia at the age of 13, but he was not an actual soldier. He was also the last president in the so-called Virginia dynasty, with 4 of the first 5 presidents being from Virginia. 32 of the first 36 years was dominated by presidents from Virginia. He was born on April 28, 1758, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His father was a farmer and a carpenter. Both of his parents had died by his 16th birthday. He was forced to leave school and take care of his siblings. His uncle stepped in to help the young Monroe so that he could attend the college of William and Mary. His uncle, who was a lawyer, a general in the militia, and a politician, introduced him to such figures such as Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and George Washington. When tensions began with the British seized the armaments of Virginia's militia. This angered the students at William and Mary College and the militia. Eventually, they would storm the governor's palace and confiscate hundreds of muskets. A few months later, Monroe dropped out of college and joined the Continental Army as a lieutenant. Monroe fought at the Battle of Trenton, where he was shot in the shoulder and severed an artery and almost died, but they found a doctor to patch him up. Monroe tried several times to recruit his own regiment, but was unsuccessful. He returned to his uncle's home and re-entered the College of William and Mary. He became close to Thomas Jefferson, who was then the governor of Virginia. He eventually would study law under Jefferson. Jefferson also encouraged him to seek a political career. In 1782, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, and later, in 1783, he was elected to serve in the Congress of the Confederation, our Congress prior to the Constitution. On February 16, 1786, he married Elizabeth Cornwright, who was a high society lady from New York. As First Lady, she had a tough act to follow. Dolly Madison was widely admired. Her health was also an issue, and at times they would have to have their daughter take responsibility to be the White House hostess. Monroe resigned from Congress and moved to an estate called Highland near Charlottesville, by the home of Thomas Jefferson. He was appointed to the Senate after one of the Virginia senators died. He left the Senate when Washington appointed him to be Minister of France at a time when there were tensions with France and Britain. Washington later recalled him due to his obvious leanings towards France over Britain. Monroe returned to Virginia and was elected governor by the Virginia legislature. In 1800, Jefferson had to call out the Virginia militia due to a slave revolt. Around 30 slaves were hanged. Monroe thought there should be somewhere outside of America to send slaves who revolted and have a permanent ban on them from the United States, instead of sending them to the gallows. Jefferson then sent Monroe back to France to assist Robert Livingston in obtaining New Orleans and West Florida. They would end up receiving all the land that France had in the United States in the Louisiana Purchase. They had no luck with Spain over West Florida. He was then appointed as the ambassador to Great Britain in an attempt to make progress with Britain over impressment. the capturing of our sailors and forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. He was offered the governorship of the newly acquired Louisiana Territory, but declined and chose to remain in Britain. Eventually, he returned home to his farm for a short time and was again elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 1810. He would serve only a few months, and then he was appointed by Madison as the Secretary of State. During the War of 1812, Monroe served as Secretary of State and Secretary of War. Madison did not fill the open position for Secretary of War, so Monroe could de facto do them both. The Senate would not approve dual cabinet positions for the same individual. Although Monroe faced some competition from his own party, he was nominated as a Democratic-Republican Party presidential candidate in 1816. He easily won the election, receiving 183 electoral votes to Rufus King's 34 electoral votes. Rufus King was a senator from New York. With the desegregation of the Federalist Party, Monroe felt free to appoint a politically diverse cabinet, including former Federalist John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams. As president, Monroe eventually managed to smooth relations with Great Britain, particularly in the Great Lakes region and the border with British North America. The Seminole Indians were attacking settlers and providing refuge to escaped slaves. Monroe sent Andrew Jackson to deal with the situation. Jackson attacked Indians and burnt their villages. While he was in Florida, he also captured the Spanish capital of Florida, Pensacola. Not in a position to defend Florida, Spain ceded Florida to the U.S., and the U.S. ceded their claims on the southwest. Spain also ceded their claims to the northwest. Latin American nations were rapidly gaining independence from Spain, but Monroe refused to recognize their independence while we were still in negotiations with Spain over Florida. After the treaty was signed, Monroe recognized the newly independent countries in Latin America. Concerned that other European countries may attempt to colonize the new Latin American nations, John Quincy Adams, the son of our second president and Monroe's Secretary of State, conceived what would be referred to as the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a warning to European powers not to interfere with the newly independent nations, and the United States would not interfere with European developments. This did not apply to colonies that were still held by the European powers in this hemisphere. Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama were approved to become states. This made an equal number of free states and slave states. But what should be done about the future growth of states? Under a compromise known as the Missouri Compromise, Missouri was brought in as a slave state and Maine entered the Union as a free state. It was further agreed that above the 3630 line, there was to be no further slavery allowed in these areas. America faced its first economic crisis in 1819. That lasted just over 2 years. The causes were multiple, such as the end of war production, land speculation, a collapse of the export market, and numerous other events. This did not cause a huge problem for Monroe's re-election campaign, however. Monroe ran unopposed in the election of 1820, receiving all but one electoral vote, the only president other than Washington to run unopposed. There is a debate about why William Plummer, who was a congressman, governor, and senator from the state of New Hampshire, voted against Monroe. Some speculate that he wanted to make sure that Washington was the only candidate to receive unanimous approval. Or, as Plummer himself said, he found Monroe incompetent. Monroe retired to his mansion at Aldie, Virginia. He spent his time reading and writing his biography, which he never finished. Monroe was faced with severe financial problems after his retirement. Much of this was caused by his service overseas. He paid many of the expenses out of his own pocket while in Europe. He would later get reimbursed for some of this by Congress, but it was too little, too late. After his wife died in 1830, he was forced to sell his home and move in with his daughter in New York. Monroe died on July 4th, 1831, at the age of 73, from heart failure and tuberculosis, the third out of the first 5 presidents to die on the 4th of July. Thanks for listening.